emissions worldwide, and we aren't. By mid-century, the bay waters could rise another 0.4 of a meter, about 16 inches, and 1.4 meters, or about 55 inches, by the end of the century. Now, to understand what future sea level rise is going to do to the bay, we need to take a look at the past. This is what San Francisco Bay looks like today. But if we go back to California's early days, you see that the bay was quite a bit bigger. It was surrounded by mudflats and wetlands. By 1950s, a third of this wet area was gone. And the bay got smaller for a very simple reason. It's shallow. 2/3 of it was less than 12 feet deep. So it was very easy to fill, and large parts of the bay were reclaimed for real estate development. If you take the period from 1850 to 1960, on average, 2 square miles of the bay vanished every year. Today, the bay is surrounded by about 240 square miles of filled land. If you want to know if you're on filled lands, it's very simple. Just go down to the bay shore and stand there. If you're standing on flat land, the chances are you're on filled land, because the natural topography were hillsides that came down to wetlands. And when that land was filled, it was only filled high enough to get it above sea levels of the past. Now, this legacy of filling the bay is a great predictor of what the bay will look like and can look like in the future. Here are 2 maps. One shows what the bay looked like in 1849. The other, what it could look like with 55 inches of sea level rise by 2100. And you say these 2 maps look pretty much the same. So at first blush, it's tempting to think this might not be bad. All that area that we lost to land reclamation in the past century and a half, we get back. It becomes part of the bay. The bad news is that we have built all kinds of expensive stuff on that low-lying real estate, stuff that is just essential to civilization as we know it. That is professional baseball. Let me give you a few other examples. This is San Francisco International Airport. The light blue is 16 inches of sea level rise. The dark blue is 55 inches. You can see that unless protected by 2100, the whole airport could be underwater. Some people look at this and say, I get the message, it's simple. Fly Oakland. Here, this is Oakland International Airport. And this is your hometown. This is Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, before it had that name, was called the Valley of Heart's Delight. And it was fruit orchards. And those fruit orchards were irrigated with well water. And as the well water was taken up, the ground elevations sank. So much of the South Bay is already below sea level. So Silicon Valley and South Bay is going to face double jeopardy, sinking land and rising seas. People generally look at the FEMA 100-year floodplain when they worry about flooding. And what this chart shows are 2 things. The blue is the current 100-year floodplain, the FEMA map. The red is 16 inches of sea level rise that may occur 40 years from now. And you see the maps are pretty much the same. So what this means is areas where FEMA now says there is a 1% chance of flooding in any one year face the possibility of a 100% chance of flooding at high tides by mid-century. Over the next century, the average water levels of the bay will rise, but shoreline areas will likely face flooding from storms before they go underwater at high tide. And a storm surge is what we get in the wintertime, when we have the highest tides, low barometric pressure, heavy rain, and wind pushing the water way across the bay and up onto the shoreline. And the scientists tell us that the kind of intense storms that we've experienced once a century in the past will face 10 times as often in the future. And we turn to a self-portrait here of me trying to figure out what we should do about this. We found that there are really 3 options. This is the first one. We wait. We don't do anything. We wait till all the scientists come to complete agreement. There's absolute certainty about climate change, and they have precise measures of where the sea levels will be in the future. However, scientists are by nature skeptical. They never reach complete agreement, and it's unlikely that future sea level rise projections will be any more definitive than the ones we have now. They will always be based on assumptions, they will always have a range of possibilities, and they will always have a degree of uncertainty. So that was alternative number one. This is the second alternative, is to begin a planned retreat from the water's edge. Prohibit all new development in low-lying areas. Above all, don't make the problem worse by building more development that will have to be protected from flooding in the future. Now that sounds pretty good, but we find if you paint with too broad a brush, you can run into some problems. Some of these low-lying areas are small. They're vacant lots, and they're in the midst of other development that will probably be protected whether or not those vacant lots are developed. Some of them are big. They are so big that they can be planned in a way that can accommodate sea level rise. And in some cases, you can use temporary structures while you're waiting for the sea levels to rise. This is a proposal for the America's Cup in San Francisco on the waterfront. Also, prohibiting all development in low-lying areas within the inner core of the metropolitan Bay Area would conflict with a regional strategy we're advancing to cut greenhouse gases. And as I explained, that strategy aims to concentrate growth near transit so we can reduce our driving, which is the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions. This strategy calls for more development in already urbanized core, not less, more growth near transit and ferry terminals, not less, and more housing in the mild microclimate of the Bay Area instead of in the inland areas where it's hotter in the summer and colder in the winter. In the end, we decided to use a third approach, which is pretty much like triage in a hospital room. We have to decide which areas will be protected at whatever the cost, where we can retreat from the shoreline and focus on natural resource enhancement, and which areas deserve special and immediate critical attention and care. And just as in an emergency room, making these public policy decisions is going to be very difficult. As we think about putting this triage process into effect, let's look at some of the challenges we have to face. I was in New Orleans recently, and it is called the impossible city at the inevitable location. Think about that. I think you could apply that same description to San Francisco, to Silicon Valley, and probably to the international airports and a lot of other areas. Some areas are simply too important to lose. So we'll try to find ways of protecting them for as long as we can, whatever the cost. Now that means we are going to have to build levees. We're going to have to build a lot of levees. And we face a double challenge in building levees in the Bay Area. They have to be big enough and strong enough to hold back rising seas and floods. And they have to be able to do it during an earthquake. In some places, we can retreat from the shoreline and focus on tidal wetland restoration. Tidal wetlands are about as close to magic as you're ever going to get when you're dealing with climate change. Because all wetlands are wonderful for flood control. They just soak up the flood water and they absorb wave energy. So the wider the wetland in the front, the lower the levee can be in the back. Tidal wetlands do something else. They actually take carbon out of the atmosphere and they put it into the ground. They sequester carbon. So tidal wetlands can be part of both a strategy for reducing greenhouse gases and a strategy for adapting to those impacts of climate change that we can't avoid. And that's why we need to take a hard look at whether there are areas along the bay shoreline where it's more cost effective to remove existing development and replace it with tidal wetlands than to try to protect low-value structures. We need to take a look at low-lying areas that have been planned for development but has not yet been built, because unless those plans address sea level rise, it's better to abandon them than to allow the development to be built and then try to protect it from flooding that may be inevitable in the future. The two things we learned from Hurricane Katrina are, first, do not build below sea level. And second, We got to figure out how to build in those areas that are not now below sea level, but may end up that way in the future. To accomplish this, we need to encourage innovation when we plan and build new areas that are vulnerable to flooding. We think that planning to accommodate sea level rise is going to be much like planning to accommodate seismic conditions. When we learned that we lived in a region that was riddled with earthquake faults, we didn't move away. Instead, we turned to the architects, the engineers, the scientists, the planners, and said, how do we build structures that won't fall down in earthquakes? We know that the bay waters are going to continue to rise. We just don't know how fast the water will rise or how high it will get. So we need to, again, turn to the architects, the engineers, the scientists, the planners, and say, how do we build around a bay that will surely get bigger? Well, some people have said the answer is simple. What we need are structures that we can quickly move out of the way as the waters rise. Others said, no. What we need are whole communities that are just designed to float. But we were looking for something truly innovative, something that nobody had thought of before. So what we decided to do was hold a design competition. We called it Rising Tides. We asked for ideas. We got 130 entries from 18 nations. They were evaluated by a multidisciplinary international jury, and we asked the jury to come up with one grand prize winner. The jury concluded that San Francisco Bay is too complex for one solution, and the solutions needed were too varied to select just one idea. So they ultimately selected 6 winners and 5 honorable mentions, all of which are posted on our website. We also had the benefit of a project funded by the Dutch government. We try to be innovative in our agency, so I decided to apply for a grant, but I applied to another nation, and I couldn't figure out how to get euros into the California budget. So what they did was took the money, and they retained Dutch universities and consultants who evaluated the conditions in the Bay Area and offered us their advice based on their hundreds of years of experience of living below sea level. To develop the Bay Area strategy that integrates sea level rise adaptation with greenhouse gas reduction, our agency, BCDC, has partnered with 3 other regional agencies that deal with land use planning, transportation planning, and air quality. Now, this kind of cooperation is absolutely essential, but cooperation alone has some limitations. If someone proposes to build a new subdivision in one of those areas around the bay that I showed you is vulnerable to flooding, none of the 4 regional agencies has the authority to say, no, you can't do that. In fact, none of them even has the authority to say, well, if you're going to build houses there, at least build a levee to protect the poor people who are going to live there. That authority rests with 101 local governments, 9 counties in the Bay Area, 55 of them front on San Francisco Bay, and there are several hundred special districts, each with their own board of directors, that deal with everything from recreation and transportation to flood control and a variety of other things. Now, as the first step in putting this triage approach into effect, what we're doing is amending the policies in our San Francisco Bay plan. This is the plan that our commission uses to guide us when we make regulatory decisions on projects along the shoreline of the bay. And it can also be used by local governments as advice. We thought this was a good idea, but we are facing a firestorm of opposition from local governments who think that we're trying to usurp their authority by simply publishing maps that show the areas are vulnerable to flooding, by developers who fear that NIMBYs will use the threat of sea level rise as a way of opposing infill development that we need to reduce greenhouse gases,